On the morning of April 6, 1945, the largest warship ever constructed slipped her moorings at Tokuyama Bay and pointed her bow toward the open Pacific. The Yamato displaced over 72,000 tons fully loaded and carried 9 18-inch guns arranged in 3 massive turrets, each weapon capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds over 25 miles. Her crew of nearly 3,000 men believed they sailed aboard an unsinkable fortress, a vessel so powerful that no enemy fleet could stand against her. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. Petty Officer First Class Naoyoshi Ishida stood on the port observation deck as the great ship gathered speed, watching the coastline of his homeland grow smaller against the grey horizon. He had served aboard Yamato for nearly 2 years, and in all that time, he had never lost his sense of awe at her sheer scale. The main turrets alone weighed more than an entire destroyer. The armor belt protecting her vital spaces was over 16 inches thick in places. Her anti-aircraft batteries numbered over 150 guns of various calibers. Ishida had heard the whispers among the crew, the quiet confidence that bordered on religious faith. Yamato was more than a ship. She was a floating shrine to Japanese naval supremacy, and her guns would scatter the American fleet like leaves before a typhoon. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Ishida and his fellow sailors did not know, what they could not have imagined in their most troubled dreams, was that the age of the battleship had already ended. Within 36 hours, 400 American aircraft would descend upon Yamato in wave after relentless wave, and the greatest warship in human history would be reduced to a tomb for over 3,000 men. The story of the Yamato's final voyage reveals not merely the outcome of one engagement, but the complete transformation of naval strategy that occurred during the conflict in the Pacific, a transformation that Japanese naval leadership either failed to recognize or refused to accept until it was far too late. To understand why the crew of Yamato placed such absolute faith in their ship, one must first appreciate the philosophy behind her creation. Japanese naval strategists in the 1930s faced a fundamental problem. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and subsequent agreements limited the total tonnage of capital ships that each major power could possess. Since Japan's industrial capacity could not match that of the United States, Japanese planners concluded that their only hope lay in qualitative superiority. If they could not build more ships, they would build better ships. Each Japanese vessel would be powerful enough to defeat any 2 American counterparts. This doctrine, known as the decisive battle strategy, imagined a single catastrophic engagement in which Japanese naval superiority would annihilate the American Pacific Fleet in one overwhelming blow. Yamato represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Her design specifications pushed beyond every existing limit. Her 18-inch guns were the largest ever mounted on a warship, 3 inches larger than those carried by any American battleship. Her armor was designed to resist shells from guns as powerful as her own. Her speed of 27 knots made her faster than most battleships, despite her enormous size. Japanese engineers even developed a special dock to construct her, since no existing facility could accommodate such a massive hull. The project consumed enough steel to build an entire fleet of smaller vessels, and the cost in labor and materials was staggering even by wartime standards. Lieutenant Commander Jiro Nomura served as one of Yamato's gunnery officers, and he had spent years training to operate the main battery. The procedures for loading, aiming, and firing those enormous guns required precision coordination among dozens of men working in confined spaces deep within the turrets. Nomura took tremendous pride in his gun crews, who could achieve a firing rate that exceeded what most experts thought possible for weapons of that caliber. He had participated in live-fire exercises where the shells had landed with remarkable accuracy at ranges beyond 20 miles. In his professional judgment, no American warship could survive a sustained engagement with Yamato. Her guns would simply pound any opponent into scrap metal before it could close to effective range. What Nomura failed to appreciate, what the entire Japanese naval establishment failed to appreciate, was that range itself had become irrelevant. The transformation had begun at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft had demonstrated that air power could cripple a battle fleet without the attacking ships ever coming within sight of their targets. The irony was profound. Japan had pioneered the very tactic that would ultimately doom Yamato and the battleship concept she represented. Yet Japanese strategists continued to view carriers primarily as scouting and support vessels, while maintaining their faith in the decisive surface engagement that would never come. The American Navy learned different lessons from Pearl Harbor and from the subsequent engagements at Coral Sea and Midway. By 1945, American naval doctrine centered completely on the aircraft carrier. Fast carrier task forces roamed the Pacific with near impunity, their aircraft able to strike targets hundreds of miles away, while the carriers themselves remained safely beyond the reach of surface gunfire. American industrial production had created an armada of carriers that would have seemed fantastic just 4 years earlier. The Essex-class carriers alone numbered over 20 ships, each capable of operating between 80 and 100 aircraft. When combined with lighter carriers and escort carriers, the United States could deploy thousands of naval aircraft across the Pacific theater. The American advantage extended far beyond mere numbers. Pilot training programs produced aviators of exceptional skill in quantities that Japan could not match. By 1945, Japanese pilot training had been reduced to minimal standards as experienced instructors were sent to combat units and fuel shortages limited flying hours. Meanwhile, American pilots received hundreds of hours of flight time before ever seeing combat, and their training emphasized realistic combat scenarios developed from accumulated battle experience. The qualitative gap in pilot skill had become as significant as the quantitative gap in aircraft numbers. Rear Admiral Kosaku Ariga commanded Yamato on her final voyage, and he harbored no illusions about the mission's prospects. Operation Tengo, as it was designated, called for Yamato and her escort of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers to sail to Okinawa, where American forces had landed on April 1st. The fleet would beach themselves on the shore and use their guns as fixed artillery to support Japanese ground forces defending the island. They carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. There would be no return voyage. Ariga understood that his command faced almost certain destruction before ever reaching Okinawa. American submarines and aircraft had established complete control over the waters between Japan and the Ryukyu Islands. Without air cover of their own, which Japan could no longer provide in any meaningful quantity, Yamato and her escorts would be exposed to attack from the moment they left Japanese coastal waters. The admiral had voiced his concerns to his superiors, but he had been overruled. The Navy General Staff demanded that the fleet sortie as a matter of honor. The greatest warship Japan had ever built could not sit idle while American forces conquered Japanese territory. She would die fighting, and her sacrifice would inspire the nation to resist to the last. Among the crew, reactions to the mission varied. Some men embraced the concept of honorable sacrifice with genuine fervor. They wrote final letters to their families and prepared themselves spiritually for what they believed would be a glorious end. Others felt deep uncertainty that they dared not express openly. Seaman Second Class Kazuhiro Miyamoto was 20 years old and had been aboard Yamato for less than 6 months. He had joined the Navy with patriotic enthusiasm, but as the ship steamed toward what everyone acknowledged was a suicide mission, he found himself thinking about his mother and his younger sisters. He wondered if his sacrifice would truly accomplish anything meaningful, or whether he would simply vanish into the sea without making any difference at all. The formation departed Tokuyama on the afternoon of April 6th, passing through the Bungo Strait and into the Philippine Sea as darkness fell. Almost immediately, American submarines detected the Japanese force. The submarine Threadfin tracked the formation throughout the night, transmitting contact reports that allowed American commanders to plot Yamato's course and speed with precision. By dawn on April 7th, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher knew exactly where the Japanese fleet was heading, and he began preparing the largest airstrike of the Pacific conflict. Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, a fast carrier force that represented the most powerful naval aviation armada ever assembled. His carriers were positioned east of Okinawa, well within striking range of Yamato's projected course. Throughout the morning, his staff calculated approach routes, fuel requirements, and ordnance loads. The aircraft would need to fly over 200 miles to reach their target, attack against formidable anti-aircraft defenses, and return to their carriers with fuel to spare. Mitchell decided to commit virtually everything he had. Nearly 400 aircraft would participate in the strike, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters for escort and strafing runs. Aboard Yamato, the morning of April 7th began with the crew at battle stations. Everyone knew that American aircraft would find them eventually. The only questions were when and in what numbers. Lookouts scanned the overcast skies, while radar operators studied their screens for any indication of approaching threats. At 10 minutes past 8, the first contact was reported. American flying boats had located the formation and were shadowing it from a safe distance, reporting position and course to the American carrier commanders. The crew of Yamato understood what this meant. The attack would come soon. Lieutenant Commander Nomura checked his fire control instruments one final time and reviewed the anti-aircraft protocols with his subordinates. Yamato carried an impressive array of defensive weapons, including over 150 guns of 25mm caliber or larger. The main battery itself could fire a special anti-aircraft round called the San-Shiki, which scattered thousands of incendiary pellets across a wide area when it exploded. In theory, this wall of fire should be able to decimate any attacking air formation. Nomura had trained his crews extensively in these procedures, but he had never faced a mass attack by carrier aircraft. No one aboard Yamato had. The first wave appeared just after 12:30 in the afternoon. 280 aircraft from Task Force 58 descended through the clouds in formations that seemed to fill the entire sky. The Japanese escorts opened fire first, their smaller guns reaching toward the approaching aircraft with streams of tracers. Then Yamato's batteries joined the barrage, and the air around the great ship became a maelstrom of explosions, smoke, and flying steel. To the American pilots, it seemed impossible that anything could survive such concentrated defensive fire. Yet they pressed their attacks with remarkable courage and precision. Commander Herbert Hauck led a torpedo bomber squadron from the carrier Hornet, and he had briefed his pilots to concentrate their attacks on Yamato's port side. If enough torpedoes struck from the same direction, they might cause the ship to capsize, rather than simply flooding compartments in a way that could be counteracted. It was a sound tactical approach, but executing it required flying straight and level for agonizing seconds while the target's guns sought to tear the attacking aircraft apart. Hauck watched two of his planes fall during the approach, but the survivors held their formation and released their torpedoes at optimal range. The first torpedo struck Yamato's port side amidships at 12:43. The impact sent a shudder through the entire ship that Petty Officer Ishida felt even in his battle station deep within the hull. Water began flooding into compartments along the torpedo defense system, and the ship developed a slight list to port. Damage control teams responded immediately, counter-flooding starboard compartments to restore balance. The system worked exactly as designed, and Yamato continued underway at high speed. But this was only the beginning. Within minutes, 2 more torpedoes found their mark on the port side. Then another pair of bombs penetrated the upper deck and exploded in crew spaces, causing casualties and starting fires. The anti-aircraft batteries continued their furious defense, and several American aircraft fell trailing smoke and flame. Yet the attacks kept coming, wave after wave of torpedo bombers and dive bombers approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. The sheer number of aircraft overwhelmed the defensive fire, creating gaps through which attackers could make their runs with reduced opposition. Admiral Arriga monitored the damage reports from the bridge, his expression betraying nothing of the despair he must have felt. Each torpedo that struck further compromised the ship's buoyancy and stability. The counter-flooding measures were reaching their limits, and the list to port was increasing despite all efforts. The engineering officer reported that several boiler rooms had flooded, reducing the ship's speed. Without full power, Yamato could not maneuver effectively to avoid torpedoes, making her an even easier target for the American pilots. The second wave arrived at 1:45, adding another 120 aircraft to the assault. By this point, Yamato's port side had absorbed at least 5 torpedo hits, and the list had increased to 15 degrees. Men struggled to maintain their footing on the slanting decks as they fought fires and carried wounded shipmates to aid stations. Seaman Miyamoto found himself helping to drag a severely injured officer away from a burning compartment, his hands slick with blood and hydraulic fluid. The officer died before they reached the medical station, and Miyamoto left him there and returned to his own battle station because there was nothing else to do. Lieutenant Commander Nomura's gunnery position took a direct hit from a bomb during the second wave. The explosion killed most of his team instantly and left Nomura himself with severe wounds to his legs and abdomen. He refused evacuation and continued directing what remained of his battery until loss of blood finally rendered him unconscious. Throughout the ship, similar scenes of desperate courage played out as men fought to keep their vessel operational against impossible odds. The training and discipline of the crew was everything that Japanese naval tradition demanded. It simply was not enough. At 2:07 in the afternoon, with Yamato listing heavily and her speed reduced to a crawl, Admiral Ariga ordered the crew to abandon ship. The command came too late for many. Moments later, the flooding reached the forward magazines and the ammunition stored there detonated in a catastrophic explosion that broke the ship apart. A pillar of fire and smoke rose over 4 miles into the sky, visible for hundreds of miles in every direction. Of the nearly 3,000 men who had sailed aboard Yamato, fewer than 300 survived. The escorts fared little better. The light cruiser Yahagi absorbed multiple torpedo and bomb hits and sank with heavy loss of life. 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sent to the bottom. American losses totaled 12 aircraft and their crews, a remarkably small number considering the intensity of the defensive fire they had faced. The disparity in casualties starkly illustrated the transformation that had occurred in naval power. The greatest battleship ever built had been destroyed by aircraft without ever sighting an enemy surface vessel, without ever firing her main guns at anything other than aircraft she could not hit. News of Yamato's loss reached the Japanese public through a brief official announcement that acknowledged the ship had been sunk while carrying out her mission. The details were kept vague, and the scale of the catastrophe was not fully understood until after the conflict ended. For the Navy, which had placed so much faith in the decisive battle doctrine and the supremacy of the big gun, the loss was both practically devastating and symbolically crushing. Japan's last operational battleship was gone, along with thousands of trained sailors who could never be replaced. The surface fleet had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Among the survivors pulled from the water by the remaining destroyers was Petty Officer Ishida, who had somehow escaped the ship before the final explosion. He spent weeks in a naval hospital recovering from his injuries and from the psychological shock of what he had experienced. In later years, he would speak rarely of the battle, but when he did, he emphasized not the horror of the attack but the courage of his shipmates. They had fought with everything they had against an enemy they could not defeat. Their bravery deserved to be remembered, even if their cause had been doomed from the start. For the American Navy, the action confirmed what had become increasingly apparent throughout the Pacific conflict. Aircraft carriers had completely supplanted battleships as the dominant force in naval strategy. The ability to project power over hundreds of miles through massed airstrikes rendered the surface engagement obsolete. American battleships continued to serve useful roles in shore bombardment and anti-aircraft defense, but they would never again be considered the primary striking arm of the fleet. The future belonged to the carrier and the aircraft it deployed. The broader implications extended far beyond naval tactics. The sinking of Yamato demonstrated the overwhelming material superiority that the United States had achieved by 1945. No amount of courage or technical sophistication could compensate for the sheer volume of ships, aircraft, and trained personnel that American industry and training programs had produced. Japan had begun the conflict in the Pacific with a philosophy of quality over quantity, but by the end, quantity had become its own form of quality. 400 aircraft attacking simultaneously created a tactical problem that no defensive measures could solve. Vice Admiral Mitcher, observing the reports from his returning pilots, took no particular satisfaction in the victory. He had lost good men in the attack, and he knew that more would be lost before the conflict ended. But he also understood the significance of what had been accomplished. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been reduced to a shell, incapable of meaningful offensive action. Whatever resistance Japan would offer going forward would come from kamikaze attacks and land-based forces, not from surface fleets steaming out to challenge American naval supremacy. The men who participated in the attack would remember it for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Junior Grade Daniel Carmichael had flown a torpedo bomber from the carrier Bennington, and he had released his weapon during the first wave. He could not say with certainty whether his torpedo had struck the target among so many others, but he had seen the great ship, staggering under the accumulated damage, and known that she was doomed. He felt no joy at the sight, only a profound relief that the mission was ending and that he would return to his ship alive. He thought about the men aboard the enemy vessel, how they had been told that their cause was just and their ship invincible, and how terribly they had been deceived by those who should have known better. The wreck of Yamato lies today in over 1,000 feet of water in the East China Sea, approximately 180 miles north of Okinawa. Japanese exploratory expeditions located the site in 1985 and confirmed that the hull had broken into two main sections, with debris scattered across a wide area of the sea floor. The site is considered a maritime grave and is protected from salvage operations. Memorial services are held periodically to honor the crew, and the ship has become a powerful symbol in Japanese culture, representing both the ultimate expression of traditional naval power and the folly of placing faith in that power when the world had fundamentally changed. The story of Yamato's final voyage illustrates a truth that extends far beyond military history. Technological superiority is always temporary, and strategic doctrines must evolve as capabilities change. Japanese naval planners had developed the battleship to its ultimate form, but in doing so, they had perfected a weapon that had already been superseded. The decisive battle they had prepared for throughout the 1930s would never be fought, because the nature of naval combat had transformed beyond their ability to adapt. They had built a cathedral when the age of cathedrals had ended. For the families of those lost aboard Yamato and her escorts, the grief was both personal and complicated by the circumstances. Their loved ones had perished in a mission that many of them had known was hopeless from the start, sacrificed to satisfy institutional pride rather than any realistic military objective. The concept of honorable sacrifice could provide some comfort, but it could not fully answer the question of whether the sacrifice had been necessary or meaningful. These were questions that would be debated for generations, and they touched on the deepest issues of duty, obedience, and the responsibility of leadership. Admiral Ariga perished with his ship, as did most of his officers. Whatever doubts he had expressed before the mission remained private, known only to his immediate superiors, and perhaps to his family through whatever final letters he may have written. He had carried out his orders with professional competence, and his crew had fought with extraordinary courage. That their efforts were futile from the beginning does not diminish their personal valor, but it does raise profound questions about the system that sent them to their deaths. The sinking of Yamato was one of the final significant naval actions of the conflict in the Pacific. Within 4 months, Japan would surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The massive battleship that had been intended to guarantee Japanese naval supremacy had barely participated in the conflict she was built to win. Her 18-inch guns, the most powerful naval weapons ever deployed, had never fired at an enemy vessel. The decisive battle for which she had been designed had never materialized. She had spent most of the conflict in port or on training exercises, too valuable to risk against the overwhelming American air power that dominated the Pacific. In the decades since, naval historians have debated whether Yamato could have been used more effectively. Some argue that earlier deployment might have achieved significant results before American carrier forces reached their full strength. Others contend that no surface force could have prevailed against the submarine and air power that the United States brought to bear. The consensus view is that the battleship era had ended before Yamato was even completed, and that no tactical decisions could have changed the fundamental strategic reality. Industrial capacity and carrier aviation had become the decisive factors in naval conflict, and Japan was inferior in both. The lesson extends to our own time. Military technologies that seem invincible today will be surpassed by developments that we cannot yet imagine. Strategic doctrines that appear sound will be rendered obsolete by changes in the nature of conflict. The only certain truth is that certainty itself is dangerous. That confidence in any weapon or tactic must always be tempered by awareness that circumstances can transform with devastating speed. The crew of Yamato believed they sailed aboard an unbeatable weapon. They learned otherwise in the final hours of their lives. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second Global Conflict, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.